"Can I play for food?" The hoarse, hesitant voice cut through the elegant conversations in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, causing heads to turn as if they had heard a fire alarm. People stopped talking, their eyes fixed on the thin, dirty figure who had dared to interrupt the city's most exclusive charity event. David Chen, 15, stood at the entrance to the main hall, his large dark eyes filled with desperate hope as he looked up at the stage where a chamber orchestra played background music for the guests. His clothes, a torn wool jacket over a shirt that was once white and pants with more holes than fabric, stood in stark contrast to the tuxedos and ball gowns around him. He held a battered violin case against his chest like a protective shield, the hinges rusted and the leather peeling, revealing decades of use. A faded military backpack hung from his shoulder, containing all his worldly possessions. "How did this kid get in here?" whispered a woman with perfectly coiffed platinum hair, clutching her Hermes bag as if David might steal it with a glance. "Where's security?" The event was a fundraising gala for Music for All, a foundation dedicated to bringing music education to underserved communities. The irony of the situation did not escape David, who had spent the last week sleeping in subway doorways and eating only when he could find food in dumpsters. Margaret Whitmore, the event organizer and heir to a family technology fortune, approached with measured, deliberate steps. At 52, she epitomized the social elite of San Francisco, educated at Stanford, refined, and completely convinced of her moral superiority when it came to helping the needy. "Honey," she said with a condescending smile that didn't reach her eyes, "this isn't the place for you. There's a shelter a few blocks from here. I'm sure they can help you better." "I just wanted to play," David repeated, his voice gaining unexpected firmness despite the hunger that made him dizzy. "Just one song in exchange for a plate of food." Laughter began to ripple through the crowd. "He thinks he can play the violin," scoffed a man in a tuxedo, twirling his champagne glass. "He probably doesn't even know how to hold the bow right." "It's adorable how imaginative these kids are," added a woman, shaking her head with feigned pity. "They watch a movie and think they can do anything." But David didn't look down. There was something about his posture, a quiet dignity, a calm confidence that seemed out of place in a child in his situation. As if he knew something that everyone else there was completely unaware of. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a renowned violinist and professor at the San Francisco Conservatory, watched the scene from the back of the hall. She had noticed how the boy's eyes had fixed on the string quartet on stage with a reverence she rarely saw, even in her most advanced students. There was recognition there, familiarity. "Margaret," Dr. Martinez approached. "Maybe we should let him play. After all, we're here to support young talent, aren't we?" Margaret laughed, a cruel, crystalline sound. "Sarah, please look at him. Children like this don't have access to music education. It's impossible." What none of them knew was that David had grown up for the first 10 years of his life in a home where music was as essential as breathing. His grandfather, Chen, had been the first violinist of the Shanghai Symphony Orchestra before emigrating to the United States in 1987, carrying only his 1895 Guarneri violin and dreams of a better life. When cancer took his parents in a car accident 2 years ago, David ended up in the foster care system. But he carried with him not only the pain of loss, but a talent that even he did not fully understand. During his difficult 5 years in the system, moving from home to home, music remained his only constant companion, played on borrowed violins when he was lucky, or on imaginary instruments during lonely nights in shelters. While everyone looked at him with disdain, David remained steadfast, like someone who had weathered far worse storms and learned to find strength in his own vulnerability. His fingers moved unconsciously, as if playing an invisible melody, a habit he had developed to calm himself in the most difficult moments. Margaret crossed her arms and laughed theatrically, as if she had heard the most absurd joke in the world. "Very well, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Since you insist so much, let's make a little deal." The crowd drew closer, sensing the smell of a cruel spectacle about to unfold. Margaret loved being the center of attention, especially when she could demonstrate her moral superiority in front of other members of high society. "First condition," Margaret announced, raising a perfectly manicured finger. "You will play only one song, and we will choose which one. Second condition, if you manage to play decently, I will personally pay for a full dinner." She paused dramatically. "But when you fail miserably, as we know you will leave here immediately and never bother respectable people again." "How cruel," whispered an older woman at the back of the group. But her voice was drowned out by the approving laughter of the other guests. David remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the quartet on stage. Something was happening in his mind, memories mingling with the present. He could almost hear his grandfather's soft voice. When people try to belittle you, let the music speak for you, my boy. Music doesn't lie, and it knows no prejudice. I accept, David said simply, his voice clear and firm. Dr. Martinez watched, fascinated. There was something about the boy's posture, the way he looked at the instrument, that intrigued her deeply. In 25 years of evaluating violinists, she had developed an instinct for recognizing true talent. And something about this child made her expert senses tingle. Perfect, Margaret clapped her hands. Now for the music. She looked around, searching for the most difficult and humiliating option possible. Her eyes landed on James Morrison, a mediocre violinist who played at local events. James, dear, what would be a suitable piece for our young artist? James smiled mischievously. How about Paganini's Caprice No? 24 foot. Everyone who has ever held a violin at least once in their life tries to play this piece. If he really knows anything, he should be able to do it. The choice drew laughter from the crowd. Caprice 24 was considered one of the most technically challenging pieces in the violin repertoire, a perfect trap. If David knew only the basics, he would try to play it and fail disastrously. If he knew nothing, he wouldn't even be able to start. Excellent choice, Margaret applauded. A piece that every child who has ever had a violin lesson knows. There are no excuses for failure. David nodded and walked toward the stage. Each step seemed charged with a quiet determination that made some people in the back of the hall feel inexplicably uncomfortable. There was something wrong with that scene. A 15-year-old child should not have so much dignity in the face of such humiliation. When David took the stage and carefully opened his battered case, an expectant silence fell over the hall. What emerged from the worn case made Dr. Martinez take a step forward, his eyes widening in surprise. The violin David pulled out was not a cheap student instrument. It was clearly antique, with a deep golden varnish that glowed under the stage lights, and even from a distance, Dr. Martinez could see the exceptional quality of the wood and construction. My God, she murmured softly. That's a Guarneri. David adjusted the violin under his chin with precise, familiar movements, not the hesitant gestures of a beginner, but the automatic movements of someone who had done this thousands of times. He quickly tested the tuning, his fingers finding the strings with a familiarity that spoke of years of dedicated practice. Margaret watched with growing discomfort. David's preparatory movements were too refined, too professional. He probably memorized this from some YouTube video, she said loudly enough for others to hear, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative. Kids these days copy anything from the internet. But her explanation sounded increasingly weak. What David was doing transcended imitation. The way he held the instrument, how he positioned the bow, how his fingers curved naturally over the strings, these were details that took years to master. Memories flooded David's mind like a wave. His grandfather, Chen, had been one of the first Chinese violinists to gain international recognition in the 1980s. When he emigrated to San Francisco, he brought with him not only his exceptional talent, but a philosophy about music that transcended technique. Music is its own universal language, David, Li used to say as he guided his grandson's small fingers over the strings. When you play with your heart, people hear with their souls, not their eyes. David had spent countless hours on that Guarneri violin, absorbing not only technique but a deep musical understanding that only a true master could impart. When Li died when David was 10, and after he lost his parents, music remained his only constant companion. We're waiting, Margaret said, drumming her fingers impatiently. Or have you given up before you even try? David took a deep breath and positioned the bow over the strings. The first touch was like electricity. After weeks without playing a real instrument, feeling the strings under his fingers was like rediscovering a lost part of his soul. The first note of Caprice 24 echoed through the hall with a crystalline purity that made several people look up in surprise. It wasn't the hesitant amateur sound they had expected. It was a note played with the confidence of someone who knew every nuance of the instrument intimately. Dr. Martinez approached discreetly, his professional curiosity fully aroused. That first note had been played with impeccable technique, precise attack, perfect sustain, controlled timbre. These were details that only years of serious training could produce. Coincidence, Margaret murmured, but her voice had lost some of its previous confidence. David began the sequence of variations that make Caprice 24 so notoriously difficult, and every note that flowed from his hands was like a small miracle. There was no hesitation, no technical errors. The music came naturally, as if he and the violin were part of a single organism. But there was something else, an emotional maturity in the performance that left Dr. Martinez completely stunned. The way he controlled the dynamics, how he allowed the silence between the notes to speak as much as the music itself. It was the work of a mature artist, not an untrained child. The room had fallen completely silent. The champagne glasses remained motionless in the guests' hands. Conversation ceased. Even the waiters stopped moving. Everyone was mesmerized by that small figure on stage, creating music of unexpected and breathtaking beauty. Margaret felt a growing unease in her stomach. This was not going according to plan. The public humiliation she had orchestrated was turning into something completely different, something that was totally beyond her control. When David reached the double harmonic section, one of the most technically challenging parts of the piece, Dr. Martinez felt her heart race. She had seen professional violinists struggle with this passage. But David navigated it with an ease that bordered on the supernatural. "That's impossible," she muttered to herself, moving even closer to the stage. Victoria watched with growing panic as the atmosphere in the room shifted completely. The laughter had ceased. The disparaging whispers turned to reluctant admiration. She could see in the eyes of the other guests a question that haunted her. If they were so wrong about this child, what else were they wrong about? David continued through increasingly complex variations, his impeccable technique married with a musicality that spoke of deep understanding, not just mechanical skill. When he reached the virtuosic finale of the piece, a dizzying sequence of arpeggios and scales at impossible speed, he showed no sign of effort. Dr. Martinez watched, fascinated, as David performed the finale with a precision she rarely saw even at elite conservatories. Every note was clear, every passage articulated with crystal clarity. It wasn't just technically perfect, it was musically inspired. When the last note died away in the absolute silence of the hall, David held the violin in position for a moment, as if reluctant to break the magical connection between himself and the instrument. Then he slowly lowered the violin and looked out at the silent crowd. There was no trace left of the shy child who had begged for food. In his place was a young artist who had just claimed his place in the world through the universal language of music. Dr. Martinez was the first to break the silence, her hands coming together in respectful applause that echoed through the hall like distant thunder. Gradually, others joined in until the Fairmont Hotel vibrated with genuine acclaim. Margaret looked around in growing panic. Her attempt at public humiliation had turned into a celebration of the talent she had tried to deny. Worse still, she could see in the eyes of the other guests the question that haunted her: if they were so wrong about this child, what else were they wrong about? David remained calmly on stage, allowing the applause to wash over him like rain after a long drought. But behind his eyes, something was forming. Not arrogance, but a growing understanding of his own power. He had proven his point, but this was only the beginning. Dr. Martinez approached the stage, her expression a mixture of admiration and professional curiosity. "Young man," she said softly, "may I ask where you studied? Your teacher must be extraordinary." David looked directly into her eyes and for a moment, allowed all the pain of the last 5 years to manifest itself in his gaze. "My grandfather taught me," he replied simply. "He said music was the one thing no one could ever take away from me." The answer struck Dr. Martinez like a bolt of lightning. A grandfather, not an expensive conservatory. Family love, not acquired privilege. Talent cultivated at home, not in elite institutions. Everything she believed about how musical excellence was created was being challenged by a 15-year-old who had just redefined her expectations of greatness. "Dr. Martinez," said a familiar voice behind her. She turned to see Dr. William Chen, director of the San Francisco Conservatory, who had arrived quietly during the performance. "That violin, may I see it?" David hesitated, then carefully handed over the instrument. Dr. Chen examined the violin reverently, his eyes widening when he saw the label inside. "My God," he whispered. "Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù, 1895. This violin is worth over $2 million. He looked at David with new understanding. "This was your grandfather's?" David nodded. "He said it was meant to be played, not kept." Even when we didn't have money for food, he never sold it. Margaret, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, finally found her voice. "That doesn't change anything," she said, her voice sounding increasingly desperate. "He's still a street kid disrupting a private event." It was then that David made a decision that would change everything. "Dr. Martinez," he said, his voice gaining new strength. "May I make a confession?" She nodded, intrigued. "I shouldn't be here tonight asking for food," David said, his posture transforming once again. The submissiveness was gone, replaced by an unshakable dignity. "I should be at Davies Symphony Hall tomorrow night, where I have a solo scheduled with the San Francisco Symphony." A deathly silence fell over the hall. Margaret felt the floor move beneath her feet. "My name is David Lee Chen," he continued, "and I am the youngest violinist ever accepted into the San Francisco Conservatory's Young Artists program. I am also the current national champion of classical violin for under 18s. He paused, allowing the information to sink in. "The reason I am here tonight is not because I need food or money." Dr. Martinez watched, fascinated, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place in her mind. "The project," she murmured. "You're doing the research project." David nodded. "Exactly. I'm collaborating with UC Berkeley on a research project about socioeconomic bias and access to the arts. My advisor suggested that I attend arts education charity events disguised as a young person without resources to document how privileged people really treat those they consider inferior." The revelation fell on the room like a bomb. Margaret felt all the blood drain from her face. You're filming us?" "Discrete cameras and high-definition audio," David confirmed calmly. "Everything that happened here tonight has been documented for academic analysis." Margaret looked around desperately, searching for cameras, any sign that this was a cruel joke. "That's illegal. You can't film us without consent." "Actually," Dr. Chen interrupted, his voice laden with dark satisfaction, "you signed image release forms when you arrived. It's written quite clearly on the ticket that this event could be filmed for documentary purposes." He smiled wryly. "I'm sure no one read the fine print." The crowd began to stir. People whispered frantically to each other, some already reaching for their phones to check their tickets. The panic was palpable. "The first part of the project," David continued, ignoring the growing chaos, "will focus on how talent and potential are overlooked when they come packaged in appearances that defy privileged expectations. The second part will show how people who claim to champion the arts react when confronted with real art coming from unexpected sources." He looked directly at Margaret. "I simply documented their true personalities when they thought there would be no consequences." Dr. Martinez approached David with deep respect. "May I ask what you intend to do with this recording?" "The project will be presented at the National Sociology Conference next month," David explained. "But I'm also creating a short documentary that will be submitted to student film festivals. My last project, filmed at a similar event in Los Angeles, won the award for Best Student Documentary at the California Film Festival." The crowd watched in horror as Margaret faced the reality of her situation. In a matter of weeks, her cruelty would be seen by academics, filmmakers, and potentially thousands of people. Her name would forever be associated with the kind of prejudice and elitism she had clearly demonstrated. "Ms. Whitmore," David said, addressing the event organizer directly, "you've spent all evening telling me that people like me don't deserve to be in places like this. That we have no value, no talent, no right to participate in high culture." His voice gained a strength that silenced the entire room. "Tomorrow, when my project is presented, the academic world will see exactly what kind of person you really are." Margaret tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. The magnitude of her impending humiliation was simply too great to process. "This is project number 8, David continued, his violin still in his hands as a symbol of his regained authority. "And it's always the same thing. People who claim to value art and education, but who judge and discard talent based solely on appearances." He turned to Margaret one last time. "The difference between you and me, Ms. Whitmore, is that when I was actually homeless for a few months after my parents died, I learned that dignity doesn't come from money or status. It comes from how we treat other human beings when we think no one is watching." The silence in the hall was deafening. Everyone present knew that their words and actions that night would be judged by academics and researchers, and most knew that there was no possible defense for what they had demonstrated. Dr. Martinez approached David. May I ask a question? Why did you choose this approach rather than simply presenting yourself as who you really are? David carefully stored his violin in its worn case. Because when I introduce myself as David Chen, a student at the conservatory, people treat me with automatic respect. But I wanted to document how they treat someone they believe to be inferior. Classical music has a serious problem with elitism and exclusion. My project aims to expose that. And you do this alone? Dr. Chen asked. I work with a research team from UC Berkeley, David explained. 3 sociologists, 2 filmmakers, and a research ethics specialist. Everything is done within the appropriate legal and ethical parameters. Margaret finally found her voice. You destroyed innocent people for academic research? David looked at her with a calmness that was more devastating than any anger. Ms. Whitmore, I simply created a situation where you showed who you really are. I didn't force anyone to be cruel. I didn't ask to be humiliated. I just offered to play music in exchange for food and documented your reactions. But the consequences? The consequences are your own actions, David interrupted her. If you had treated me with basic dignity, there would be nothing embarrassing in the film. Dr. Martinez watched the exchange with professional fascination. David, do you plan to continue this work? For another 2 years, he replied. I want to document systematic patterns of discrimination in elite cultural spaces. The data already shows troubling trends about how socio-economic class affects perceptions of artistic merit. A year later, David's project had been published in the Journal of Cultural Sociology and presented at international conferences. The documentary Invisible Virtuoso won awards at student film festivals and was used in university curricula for discussions about prejudice and access to the arts. Margaret Whitmore lost her position in all of San Francisco's cultural organizations. Her event planning company lost important clients, and she was forced to move to Portland, where she tried to rebuild a reputation that may never fully recover. The Fairmont Hotel, embarrassed by the public exposure, created a scholarship program for young musicians from underserved communities, naming David as its first ambassador. Music knows no social class, zip code, or bank account, David said in his first national interview after the incident. It only knows passion and dedication. When you have both, no social barrier can stop you. Dr. Martinez became David's official mentor, helping him navigate both the world of professional music and his emerging career as a social researcher. The project's impact transcended entertainment. Conservatories across the country started community outreach programs, revised admission processes, and hundreds of talented young people from underserved communities received opportunities previously denied to them. My grandfather always said that music is a universal language, David reflected 2 years later, now 17 and about to enter the joint Conservatory Berkeley program. But I discovered that the world of classical music had forgotten that. My project just reminded people that talent can come from anywhere. 3 years after that transformative night at the Fairmont Hotel, David Chen was on stage at Carnegie Hall in New York, tuning the same Guarneri violin that had silenced a room full of prejudice. At 18, he had become not only one of the most promising violinists of his generation, but also a respected voice in the fight for inclusion in the arts. His documentary series Hidden Virtuosos had expanded to 15 episodes, each exploring different aspects of discrimination in elite cultural spaces. The work had inspired policy changes at conservatories, shifts in media coverage of young artists, and the development of new community outreach programs. On that particular night at Carnegie Hall, David wasn't just performing, he was inaugurating the Li Wei Chen Memorial Concert Series, an annual program featuring young virtuosos from non-traditional backgrounds. In the audience, among the familiar faces of teachers and colleagues, David could see Margaret Whitmore. She had driven 5 hours from Portland to be there, not as a member of the social elite, but as a volunteer in a local community music program. The public humiliation had become, strangely, a catalyst for genuine personal change. 3 years ago, David said into the microphone before beginning his performance, I learned that music has the power not only to move hearts, but to expose truths. Tonight, I would like to dedicate my performance to all young artists whose talent is overlooked because of where they come from or how they look. He positioned his violin, the same instrument his grandfather had protected through decades of hardship. My grandfather taught me that music is a universal language. But sometimes we need to remind the world that universal really means universal. The first note of Massenet's meditation floated through the hall with a purity that made the audience hold their breath. But this time, David wasn't playing to prove a point or expose hypocrisy. He was playing to heal, to unite, to show that music transcends all barriers when we allow it to do so. In the audience, Margaret closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. For the past 3 years, she had worked tirelessly with underprivileged children, trying to make up for decades of privileged prejudice. The work didn't erase her behavior that night, but it had taught her that genuine change was possible when you started with real humility. After the performance, during the reception, Margaret approached David hesitantly. "David," she said, her voice heavy with 3 years of reflection, "I'd like to thank you." He looked at her curiously. "For showing me who I really was," she continued. "It was humiliating, but necessary. I spent 3 years learning to see talent and value where before I saw only social limitations." David considered her words carefully. "Ms. Whitmore, what do you do now?" "I run a music program for children in Portland. 50 students, mostly from low-income families. Some are extraordinary," she smiled shyly. "I'm learning that talent really has no address." "And they know your story?" Margaret nodded. "They know I used to be exactly the kind of person who would have overlooked them. It keeps me honest." David reached out his hand. "Then maybe my project worked better than I imagined." Dr. Martinez, who had been watching the exchange, joined them. "David, do you still plan to continue the documentary series?" "One last season," he replied. "But this time, I want to focus on stories of redemption. People like Mrs. Whitmore who used the exposure of their prejudices as a catalyst for real change." "And after that?" David smiled, looking at his grandfather's violin carefully stored in its case. "After that, I just want to play music. But music that's available to everyone, not just the privileged." 6 months later, David announced the creation of the Chen Foundation for Universal Music Access, funded by royalties from his documentaries and donations from individuals inspired by his work. The foundation would provide instruments, lessons, and performance opportunities to talented young musicians, regardless of their financial situation. The first beneficiary was a 12-year-old girl from Oakland who played the violin on cardboard instruments she built herself. When she received a real violin through the foundation, her first performance was a version of Amazing Grace that brought even David to tears. "My grandfather always said that music finds a way," David reflected in his last interview before moving to Vienna for advanced studies. "What I've learned is that our responsibility is not to block that path with our prejudices." When asked about Margaret Whitmore and others who were exposed in his documentaries, David was thoughtful. Public humiliation was not the goal. Change of consciousness was. If some people used that experience to become better versions of themselves, then it was worth it. His final message was simple but powerful: talent doesn't choose where to be born. Our responsibility is to ensure that it has room to grow, regardless of the zip code or bank account it comes from. Years later, as young musicians from around the world played in concert halls that once seemed inaccessible, many carried with them a lesson David had inscribed on the wall of the foundation's office: "Music is a universal language, but only when everyone is allowed to speak it." David's story proved that sometimes the moments of greatest prejudice can become catalysts for the most profound change. And that true virtuosity lies not only in playing perfect notes, but in using our art to build bridges where others have erected walls. If this story of hidden talent and social justice touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever witnessed prejudice based on appearances that masked genuine talent? Have you ever underestimated someone based on first impressions? Share your experiences in the comments about how appearances can be deceiving. Remember, sometimes the most talented person in the room is exactly the one you least expect. The question is not where talent comes from, but whether we are willing to recognize it when it comes in unexpected packages. Comment "talent without borders" if you also believe that genius can come from anywhere when we give it a chance. See you in the next video with more stories that prove that prejudice can blind us, but true talent always finds a way to shine. #Can I play for food? They laughed at the homeless beggar, not knowing that he is a violin prodigy.